Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure to accidentally, serendipitously, have a chance to talk to Paul Hockings, whose work I've known for many years and whose books I've used in my teaching, and whose students have talked often of your work in South India. Paul, when were you born?
I was born in 1935 and had an immediate association with India a roundabout way. I was born about 2 kilometers from Haileybury College, where all the East India Company officials were trained. My father, who was a county cricketer in a very bad county, Hertfordshire, used to regularly play at Haileybury, and so that's where things started. Many years later, I ended up spending years and years in India, not directly as a result of the Haileybury connection. It was just one of those odd coincidences, I suppose. My father was an engineer, and he came, I think, from a religiously mixed background. It appears to me, though nobody ever talks about it, that his mother was Jewish and his father was some sort of Protestant. But his mother was a very progressive school teacher, so she sent all of her children, 5 of them, to the best Christian schools in London, which was why my father ended up in Westminster Abbey as a choir boy, with already a rather pronounced nose. But anyway, religion was never mentioned in the family, and nobody chased us off to church, temple, or anything. My mother was equally mixed up because her father was Irish and I think Catholic, married to a Protestant lady, and so they sort of compromised with their children, brought them up as Anglicans and sent them to convent school. And so her father was actually the mayor of Hoddesdon for a while. That's where they lived. But the distant ancestors were mostly from villages around Cambridge. And for many decades, in fact, many generations, practically nobody in this family had ever been outside England. It was, typical small middle-class family with roots in small towns like Hoddesdon. But my father was from North London. And there were 2 exceptions. One was my uncle, who was the only person other than me who got a degree in something, in his case in French. And he'd studied in France, and later he was a British consul in Syria. And a great uncle, even more oddly, was a camel driver in Central Australia. But as for that, everyone else, we just grew up in England. I didn't grow up in Hertfordshire, but in Hampshire. It seemed a safer place to be during the Second World War, although in point of fact I was still bombed. But when I was 9, I got the idea that what I was really interested in was prehistory and museums. This came as a big surprise to my parents, and even more to my school teachers, who you couldn't say there was anything wrong with it, but at the same time found it a trifle odd. And
why the prehistory of museums? I mean, what had sparked this?
I think it was a reaction to the history master, who insisted that everything began in 1871.
I see.
And he was a sort of socialist gentleman who, was forever going over the same.
At the age of 9. At the age of 9, he was doing this.
It started. By the time I was about 11, I think I was formulating these ideas, and he was formulating his. So nobody in the school helped me or really encouraged me in this. But sometime after the Second World War was over, the Basingstoke Museum reopened, and I was living in that area in Hampshire. So I went and introduced myself to G.W. Willis, who was the curator and the founder of that museum. Very interesting man. He'd never married. He had been the mayor of the town for a while. He was totally self-educated. He'd never been to college. He was a very competent watchmaker, a job he'd learned from his father, and he'd read all the classics of 19th century natural science, and strongly believed in geological sedimentation and evolution and all those kinds of things. And he very kindly spent several hours a week for years and years talking to me about this and that as I developed this very detailed knowledge of the locality of places within about 10 miles of Basingstoke. He was especially good on prehistory. He had amassed what the Ordnance Survey later said was the largest collection in Britain of stone tools from the Paleolithic and Neolithic, which he had found in surfaces by just walking over farm fields for decades. And so he gave me a lot of encouragement, and rather surprisingly, one of our neighbours who was a good friend of his was the Duke of Wellington, and he was also interested in me and gave me encouragement to stay in this line of interest because nobody else saw there was any point in being interested in what I was interested in. And as I became a teenager, I realized there were actually on occasion jobs in this area in the form of curatorships of small museums. But I also knew right away you have to have a degree to do that. And the pay was not wonderful, but that was the sort of thing I was interested in. And my very first job was as a warden in the Basingstoke Museum. It's now called the Willis Museum. And I was about 15. So that was that, and it looked as though, I would end my grammar school days. Both Mr. Willis and I had been to the same school.
Which school was it?
Which was, at that time, was called Queen Mary's. It had been founded by Bloody Mary in 1555, 56 or something like that. It appears to have been the only good thing she ever did. But one of the much earlier students of that school, who was a kind of role model, I guess, for Mr. Willis and me too, was Gilbert White, who was a natural historian, perhaps the first British natural historian. And I found that George Willis's approach to the environment there was very similar to what you see in the natural history of Selborne. In fact, we both went to Selborne and walked around the places where White had been and written about. And then something dramatically different came along. My father was an engineer by training. In those days, you didn't have to go to university to be an engineer. He had picked it up as an apprentice. He was a personal assistant to Henry Royce, who founded the Rolls-Royce Company. And then, I think for a while, he made pianos, or the machinery of pianos. During the Second World War, unlike most families which were ripped apart, he just stayed home with us, and he designed the landing gear for the landing equipment for D-Day. And on the basis of these sort of pseudo-qualifications, when he was nearly 50, he decided to emigrate to Australia and look for a job there, which he was quite successful at. He did very well in Australia. But by that time I was 17, he said, well, you can stay or you can come. The problem with staying in Britain, as I saw it, was that I definitely needed money to go to university, and while one can certainly do great things in prehistory in Oxford or Cambridge and maybe some other places too, the fees were the problem. My parents didn't have money to send me, and they said, frankly, well, if we send you, we have to send your brother and sister too. And if I was very lucky, I might have got the Hampshire County Scholarship, £150 a year, which even in those days wouldn't have gone very far. So I went to Australia with them, although I never lived with them after that. A few months later, I got a Commonwealth Scholarship there and immediately headed for the best university in the country, which was also the only place which had an archaeology department, and an exceptionally good one for this reason.
And that was Sydney, was it?
Sydney teaches Near Eastern archaeology, whereas if you go to British universities, Liverpool or London, various places, it's Palestinian archaeology, or Egyptology, or Anatolian archaeology. And nobody in that stage was putting it all together the way they obviously do now in Cambridge, for example. So I got a very, very solid education in Near Eastern archaeology there. The place was British enough that it had two totally separate departments, anthropology and archaeology, and the personnel of these two departments were known to have talked to each other. I managed, therefore, in fact I had to do a double major in archaeology and in anthropology separately, which took me 4 years because it was...
When did you start it? What?
1952.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I began to take anthropology more seriously, and it sort of slowly dawned on me there were actually more jobs available in anthropology, social anthropology, than there were in archaeology, especially in Australia. The rumour was then, if you went back to Britain, as many people did after they finished a BA, you would find there were about 33 anthropologists in Britain, and if one of them happened to die, you might be in line for a job. This didn't seem like very good prospects, so I didn't consider that. Instead, I decided to go to North America.
Were there any teachers in the university who you remember as influencing you a lot, or were outstanding?
Yes. The main person I studied under was A.P. Elkin, who, I don't know if you're familiar with the history of the department, but Radcliffe Brown started it in 1925 with money he got from the Rockefeller Foundation. And then after about 5 years there, it was time for him to move on, I think, to Chicago. And so Raymond Firth came, and he was there for 18 months or so. And then he got his appointment in London, and so they found this rather obscure pastor of some religious organization, A.P. Elkin, who had, however, studied anthropology in Britain. And I'd been to a high school in Australia for about 6 months just to qualify for the Commonwealth Scholarship, which I obviously needed. And by a very odd coincidence, the principal of that high school in some small provincial town, it wasn't in Sydney, had been the close friend of Elkin and Arthur Capel, the linguist, and the three of them had all gone to London together. And so where my parents and uncle and others are saying, well, it'd be much more sensible if you went to teachers' college so that you could teach French, like your uncle teaches French. And so I said, no, I'm sticking with this. And the headmaster of that school backed me thoroughly, just as Mr. Willis and the Duke of Wellington had backed me in Britain, that this was not a stupid idea, and you can do something with it. But the department was still very strongly Radcliffe Brownian 25 years after he left. They were still following his research program for covering each and every tribe. And it was a bit stultifying because, we spent 1 year learning Australian kinship systems backwards. Until we were nearly as good as the Aborigines at them. But it only went so far, and already I was aware, maybe from the archaeology training, that environment was much more important than these people were ever letting on. You don't just have a kinship system, it's out there in the desert somewhere and it's reacting to things. There was a bunch of maybe half a dozen of us at Sydney who formed the Sydney University Art Group, and it was me and Robert Hughes, who became the art editor of Time magazine, and 3 or 4 others, and we established this sort of rather bohemian organisation. It had lots of fun, tended to produce neo-Dada, nothing very exciting in the art field. But it was a statement to the university that why didn't they have an art department, as they didn't in those days. And I used to be pretty active in a lot of student organisations, the World University Service, and I was the only non-Indonesian member of the Indonesian Students Association, and so on and so on. And I thought it would be very good for this campus if we had a sort of popular lecture series on art. And I'd sort of dreamt up 4 or 5 people who I know were good lecturers and interesting to hear. I think the general topic I chose was religious art for some reason, maybe not. But I knew the one person I had to get to start it was Sir Arthur Trendall, who was the Vice Chancellor of the university, who was the Professor of Greek and Classical Archaeology. I'd studied under him. By general agreement, he was one of the greatest minds in Australia. He had only one sort of oddity about him, and that was he was now about 55. He'd never been married, except for his years at Cambridge. He had always lived with his mother, and still lived with his mother, and from comments he would make at cocktail parties and so on about he had to go home now and so on. It's pretty clear he was very devoted to his mother. But I wanted him to start off this popular lecture series because he was a brilliant public speaker, public lecturer on classical art, a subject he knew a great deal about. And he was very adept with slide projector. He would have everybody interested in his subject and keep them interested all the way through. Rather like Jacob Bronowski, that kind of approach to his subject. He could pitch it to his audience exactly right. So I needed to get Trendall on board. I phoned him at his house one night. There was a sort of tremor in his voice as I sort of quickly explained why he's called. He said, "My dear man, my mother has just died 10 minutes ago." What do you say? You know, it's like, oh, okay, I'll call you later or something. I don't know how I got out of that, but we eventually got him to lecture.
Oh dear.
He was terrible.
Mm.
Anyway, it was clear that the employment situation was no better in Australia than it was in Britain vis-a-vis, being a professional anthropologist. And I also by now had formulated a long-term plan. I already knew quite a number of people, you must know many who did this as well. They do a BA in some subject at some university. Then they stay there, because after all they know all these lecturers and professors now, and they do an MA there. And then maybe at this point they get married and have one child or something to complicate things. And then they decide, well, the easiest thing to do to finish off would be to do a PhD in the same department. And so they do. And as a result, they have 6 professors very, very well, and their ideas on everything. But what they don't know is how important these 6 professors are. So I thought it makes much more sense if you're going to do 3 degrees to do them in 3 different universities. In my case, I did them in 3 different countries. That way, I would get, I stayed in Anglophone countries, but even so, I would get a much better perspective on American versus British anthropology. And so that said, I headed off to New Zealand, and I worked as a scriptwriter for New Zealand Broadcasting, wrote some newspaper articles, worked as a wool classer in Auckland, the Australian connection with sheep, and that was a dirty job. But anyway, much more usefully, I took part in excavation of the very earliest landing site of the first moa hunters in New Zealand, which was a beautiful place to begin with. The moa hunters knew what they were doing, and was a very useful field experience. Then I went to Vancouver. I worked a little bit in University of British Columbia Museum. I set up a display for them on diffusionism. And I started working as a scriptwriter for CBC. Then, not being very well endowed with cash at this point, I hitchhiked right across Canada in the middle of the winter.
Wow.
And ended up in Toronto, where unfortunately I had a friend who could sort of bail me out. And I continued script writing for CBC, writing newspaper articles for the Toronto Globe and Mail, and landed a job as a librarian at the university library, which was not very well paid, but it was invaluable because I really knew libraries inside out by the time I'd spent a few months there. And that, of course, paid off later. Then I went to talk to McIlwraith. Tom McIlwraith was probably the first professional anthropologist anywhere in Canada, and he was the chairman of the department there. And he said he'd be happy to take me in as a graduate student, and he could give me a teaching assistantship. He said, it'll take you 2 years. But if you're willing to write 3 papers a week, you can graduate in 8 months.
Good heavens.
So I wrote 3
Graduate,
papers.
you mean get a PhD?
I'm an MA.
MA, yeah.
We're at the MA level still.
Yeah.
So I wrote 3 papers a week for 8 months. I certainly learned how to write. And McIlwraith was so old, he'd studied under Haddon and Rivers
Really?
at Cambridge. You know? A nice old gentleman. And I had other very good teachers there, Ronald Cohen,
Oh, yes.
who was excellent on methodology, social structure, and so on.
Nice man.
Very nice man, charming.
Mm.
In fact, most of my best professors were Jewish like him.
Mm.
He encouraged me, go for the best, and as I've been to the best university in Australia and now the best university in Canada, I thought, well, we'll try for the US.
Mm.
So I wrote to 2 or 3 of the top universities there. The problem was you had to have some figure like $3,000 in your pocket before they'd give you a visa to cross the border.
Hmm.
I didn't have $3,000, but I wrote to Harvard, Wisconsin, and Berkeley. Clyde Cluckham wrote back to me from Harvard and said, well, come here, and if we like you after 6 months, we'll find something for you. So I thought, well, that doesn't take care of the first 6 months, so we disregarded that. The chairman at Wisconsin said, we'd be delighted to have you here, and we can give you $250 a year to live on, which also didn't seem like enough. The chairman at Berkeley at that time was Sherwood Washburn, who was a student of Hooton's, and of course the man who practically invented primatology. He just wrote back saying, we have appointed you as a teaching assistant with, this, that, and the other remunerations. We expect you here in September. So obviously, that's where I went. And it was a superb experience. At that time, Galbraith, who was a graduate from Berkeley and I think from Toronto as well, but anyway, Galbraith, who was a Berkeley product, had written something to the effect of...
The famous Galbraith.
Yes, John
Kenneth
Kenneth Galbraith. He said that Berkeley is arguably the best university in the world, not just in the US. As it happened, although I did my degree at Berkeley, I also studied 2 others of the best, because I spent a summer in University of Chicago and got to know Sol Tax very well, and we were friends for many years. And I studied under Milton Singer, who was Redfield's student there. And I also had spent a year at Stanford, which was where I met Srinivas. So I had these things going for me. Then something else happened.
We're going to come back to Srinivas later.
We can, yes,
Yeah.
we can. When I got to Berkeley, they had in fact assigned me as teaching assistant to T.D. McCown, famous physical anthropologist. That's what I had to teach.
How do you spell him?
McCown, M-C-C-O-W-N. He was the man who went to Palestine with Dorothy Garrett in the 1930s, and they discovered Mount Carmel Man, the Neanderthals there. And he spent the rest of his life, I think, publishing on the Neanderthals there. A very nice man. I think he was educated in Britain, like many of them were.
Dorothy Garrett was at Cambridge, of course.
Yes, yes. I think that's where he was too. After a little while, though, I was already taking courses with David Mandelbaum, because I decided India was what I was interested in. And so Mandelbaum made me his research assistant, and I worked with him on a couple of books. One was The Teaching of Anthropology, which he organized a big kind of UNESCO seminar that he pulled together, and the other was Society in India, that he'd been working on for 2 decades, I guess. But he was an exceptionally fine teacher. He had read everything. He really knew the literature. He produced one of the few general books about society in India, which took account of regional variations and didn't just try and generalize.
And a nice man again?
Mandelbaum.
A nice man?
A nice man, a really nice man, yes, a student of Sir Piers. And he also was a stickler for good writing style, and I think appreciated the fact that I seemed much better at French and German than he did. So much of my research activity was summarizing books in foreign languages, which ended up as paragraphs in Society in India. Anyway, that was fine. It meant I was being paid to read lots of books. And then, in 1961, I suppose, he got onto a committee. He was on lots of committees. He got onto a national committee of people who teach about India to set up the American Institute of Indian Studies. Him, Milton Singer, several others were involved in this. And so I said to him, with a certain amount of self-interest, that very soon you're going to find there are lots of Indian graduate students in the US, and they're going to be wanting field research funds to go back to India just to do their research. So you better make sure that when the details of this institute are set up, the grants don't require US citizenship. So he swallowed this, and when in the spring of 1962 they made their very first field research grant, it was to this Englishman. And the Americans came along soon after, of course, but very soon there were Indians getting those grants, just as I suspected. So I went to India, I went to the Nilgiris, although my original plan had been to do what Chris Fuller in fact did, study the great temple in Madurai and the whole pilgrimage business. Mandelbaum said, oh, you don't want to go there, it's very hot and dirty, you know. You should go to the Nilgiris, which is so beautiful, and which is, of course, where he did his Kota studies. And it made sense because most of the tribes on the Nilgiris, like Todas, Kotas, and Kurumbas, were very well studied. I mean, there's now over 10,000 pages of print on Todas if you hunt it down. It's a massive ethnography. But the Badigas, who are the dominant group and the central group in this whole symbiosis between various tribes, had never been studied at all. So that's what I did, and that's what I eventually got a PhD on. It seemed that I began falling into jobs. You don't get jobs that way these days.
Are you going to talk about your fieldwork, or
I can. It went very smoothly. I went there. I started in the collector's office for the first month or two, looking at land records and maps and so on.
Can you remember your first arrival in the Nilgiris?
Oh yes, it's everybody, I guess, either takes the bus or takes the train and ends up there.
Climbing up.
It climbs up the Gaunt Road, and you end up in this, what was then still a very British kind of a town, Utkamund, or Uti as it's always been called. Mandelbaum had given me a really useful introduction, and this is what everybody needs and usually doesn't get. There was a man, a peasant farmer named Desing, who was a Badiga, who had helped Mandelbaum in the 1930s as an interpreter. He knew English quite well, very well really. He'd helped Mandelbaum as an interpreter and got him around to a few villages and so on. The same man had also worked with Emino, who published one paper on the vowels of the Badiga language based on the way Desing spoke. And so he knew these two Berkeley scholars very well from those years in the 30s. So when I turn up, and further I'm Mandelbaum's student, and Emino's student too, he was, very happy to not only take me in hand, but he knew exactly what I was after. And this man was fantastic as an informant. I mean, you couldn't have invented a better informant, I don't think. We won't talk about statistical sampling here if you've only got one good informant. But he had obviously been a quite brilliant boy. He'd gone to the municipal high school in Uti. The school leaving exam, he said, and I assume this was true, that he got 100% on mathematics, very high scores on typing and several other subjects. And something happened to him then, which doesn't happen now. Madras University wrote him a letter inviting him to join the university because it was a tremendously high score. And at that point, his grandmother lay across the door and said, literally over my dead body, she didn't have a living son, and so she said, if you go away and I die, you will not be there to perform my rites. And so his grandmother stopped him going to the university. Instead, he ended up teaching kids English in the village, and after a while they arranged a marriage for him. And that was sort of the end of his academic career right there. He never made it to college. And so far as I know, he never attended public lectures or that kind of thing as in the normal course of his life. He was farming. He ended up with a son and 4 or 5 daughters, whom he had to marry off somehow, so life was a great burden for him. But this was a man, you could sit down with him, and he agreed he would work with me 3 hours every morning, and I could write notes as much as I liked. And I was going to him for about 9 months for 3 hours every morning writing notes. You could say to him something like this: tell me about how old people spend their time. He'd give you a 1-hour lecture on it, non-stop, and no padding. I wasn't paying him by the hour. I agreed I'd give him a monthly salary, so he didn't have to pad. So this was one thing. He knew about everything because he should have been the traditional headman of his village, but he didn't want to be, so he gave his brother the job. So he knew all about the structure of the society from that. Another thing that was great about him was if you asked him something that he didn't know much about, he didn't make it up. He said, well, there's so-and-so over there in that village, we'll go over and talk to him. And since I was paying him anyway to go over and talk to somebody else, no matter, So he'd take me to the right people for specialized information. His English was so good that we did practically everything in English, just wrote down, vocabulary words in Badiga. But this worked superbly and gave me the sort of central core of my data on Badiga culture, but I realized there was a problem with working with one informant. And so I designed a social survey and interviewed 600 or 700 people across the Nilgiris. I didn't realize at the time I'd done something pretty extraordinary. When people in the States heard I'd done this at a rate of $1.50 per informant, where here they spend, in the States, $50 or $60 per informant or so. But it worked. The problem was largely that the people I was going to interview were not just Badigas, they were from all sorts of ethnic groups, speaking 13 languages, of which we had to use at least 5 as lingua francas. And so I got hold of a class of economics students from a local college, trained them in interviewing, because they'd already been out with their lecturer and done a study of some village. They liked that. So I trained them in interviewing, and we went out for about 6 weeks interviewing something like 700 people in 5 languages. And later I brought all that material back to Stanford. I got a year's research assistantship at Stanford. We coded all of the answers to this massive survey. I won't even begin to talk to you about problems of sampling in a mountain environment, but there were some. We coded it, and I processed it on a very early IBM 7090 computer, which would have more or less filled this room.
What year was this?
That would have been And at that point I didn't have a job. I could have talked to McIlwraith because he literally knew every anthropologist in North America and was perfectly happy to get on the phone and say, a student of mine needs a job, so please find him a job, like that, and it worked apparently. One would expect one's sort of thesis supervisor to be the person to do this. Mandelbaum never lifted a finger in this direction. And I didn't say, look, couldn't you please call somebody and see if you can find some job for me? And then I just fell into a job. I was talking to Srinivas at the Center for Behavioral Studies in Stanford. He introduced me to Walter Goldschmidt from UCLA. And I mentioned to Goldsmith, just finishing a PhD and needing a job. He said, well, why don't you come to UCLA? So he said, mail us your resume. So they just gave me a professorship like that. I know people who hear this will be green with envy. Now you will have 500 applicants and a series of committees to break it down to a short list and so on.
This was an associate or assistant or what kind of professorship?
Assistant professor, that's the starting level. So I processed all of this data that came out of this huge social survey using this primitive elephant of a computer at Stanford. Some poor girl punched the data physically into IBM punch cards. They have little holes in them. And that was how data was stored in those days. And then you run it through a machine, and the machine sorts it according to where the holes are being punched, and gives you distributions of any kind of variable you want to look up. And very quickly you can produce, distribution graphs with thousands of numbers on them and lots of useful stuff. I didn't use that material very much, really. I cited a few bits of it which I had got out of a preliminary sort of these punched cards in my doctoral dissertation, which, by the way, I never published, and then did nothing more with it, though I knew eventually I probably should get back to this and sort it out, because it was, after all, quite a big study and it was all original data that nobody else knew about. And then many other things happened. I was involved with film, as you know. I was involved with teaching endlessly and writing a number of other books. And in the late 1990s, I decided I wanted to do a book about demography. This came for a very fascinating reason, really. I'd been doing a longitudinal study in 4 villages in the center of the Nilgiris Hills, all Badiga villages. And one of the longest longitudinal studies, except perhaps for Scarlett Epstein's, in India. I had taken censuses in these 4 villages of 100% of the population every 9 years over a 27-year period. And 27 years was almost exactly 1 generation there, according to the way I calculated it. And so I had all of this census data about who was living in every single household, and lots of details about each household. And the 4 villages were close together, within sight of each other, and represented 4 different strata in Badiga society from top to bottom. And since they were so close together, it meant historical factors, environmental factors, geographical factors were all held constant. They'd all been subjected to the same influences, you see. And so I wanted to now, finally, in the late 1990s, digest all this, having finished my last of the 27-year survey, and see what had changed demographically. And to make the long story very short, the one thing that had really changed was immediately dead in the halfway point through this 27-year period, the women decided to adopt birth control. And right after that, there was a demographic transition. Standard of living went up, number of children dropped to even lower than it is in Japan. They're not even producing enough children to reproduce the parental generation now. Tremendous change. And it's all documented statistically in these censuses I did. then I wanted to put this into a book, but make it a more general book than just about, here's some demography. I wanted to talk about the influences that had to do with modernization, and these two I'd been able to quantify when I did that social survey, because it had come through these villages as well. Then I had to face the problem. I'd still got several thousand of these punch cards in my office, and I telephoned our computer center and said, you have one of these machines, they're about the size of a piano, you know, and I'd seen it over there somewhere. I said, one of these machines that sorts these IBM punch cards. They said, oh yeah, we know what you mean. Yeah, we had it, but to tell you the truth, we threw it out recently. It was just taking up too much space. So I was also, and still am, an adjunct curator in the anthropology department at the Field Museum of Natural History. They've got lots of equipment. So I phoned over there, got hold of the man who said, yeah, I know what you mean, we had one, but you know, so big, we just got rid of it, you know. So I thought, well, there's only one answer to this. The Museum of Science and Industry, which is right next to the University of Chicago, of course they've got it because it's a museum. So I phoned them. I got hold of the man who might have to deal with anything to do with, you know, computer equipment. He said, oh yeah, you know, we just threw ours out recently. It's taking up too much space. And he said, the only thing I can think of is somewhere on the East Coast, IBM has a museum. So I thought, I'm not going to the East Coast of the United States with these boxes of punch cards to hear the same story again. But, and there's a good outcome to this, somewhere in the 1970s or 1980s, I did have the forethought to give all of these cards to our computer center and have them stored in a social science data archive there and on computer tape. So I phoned the person in charge of that, and they mailed me one tiny 3.5-inch floppy disk, and the entire social survey was on it and is still readable. And that was what saved me. And so I brought out a book called Kindreds of the Earth, which is a sort of conspectus of everything I can think of to say about modernization in Badaga villages and the demographic basis of it.
So the message to the future is be very careful about changes in storage media.
Yes, and especially where film is concerned, because ask yourself, you know, is the data that you're presenting in this format, going to be accessible in 50 years' time? And this goes for computer formats like those floppy disks, DVDs, and lots of things. Particularly, think twice before you publish a book on the internet. Is that going to be the only format it's available in? You know, this is a serious matter. We've been debating it for years in ethnographic film, because already by about 1980 or so, we had the idea that it would be possible to put an entire film on a disc, be able to mail it anywhere in the world, and they can use it in a high school, and you haven't lost the original archival copy. And of course, another 10 years later, that did come along. We do that now. But it was a dream, I guess, back in the 1980s, and of those days we had discs. They were about this size. I suppose about the time I went to Berkeley, Aldous Huxley was living in Beverly Hills and had this terrible tragedy. His entire house burnt to the ground in a brush fire, and he lost all sorts of valuable stuff, and I think he lost masses of money on the deal, and he needed to make some money quickly. So Berkeley decided to give him a visiting professorship for one semester. And this wasn't to be grand public lectures or anything like this. This was to be a closeted group of a dozen selected students in a seminar, but I managed to get selected. So, you know, I got to know Huxley quite well, and learned one or two useful things out of him, not about novel writing, although he did talk about it sometimes. One basic thing about his procedure was, whatever the subject is, the best thing to do is to treat it historically. Start at the beginning and move through. I believe his favourite reading was the Encyclopaedia Britannica. He was constantly citing really obscure articles from the better editions of the Britannica to us that he'd obviously read and memorised.
Yes, did he have a photographic memory, do you think?
I want to get onto that because this is a really odd thing about him. He was nearly blind.
Yes, I've read his book on eyesight. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
It's very interesting.
But I saw it. He wouldn't waste a minute. He's waiting for the seminar to begin. He's got something there, and he's reading. You can see the speed he's reading at because he's using a magnifying glass, you know. And he said something to me that I found extraordinary, more or less in answer to your question. He said to me one time, I can't visualize a scene. You'd think, what a novelist. He gets the picture, he writes it down. He said, no, what I see is sentences and paragraphs.
Well, that would fit, because if he's moving across, it's typical myopia. It's pinball vision, or pinpoint vision, isn't it?
Yes, yes. That's the way he said he was writing these novels, making them up as pieces of literature, so to speak, the structure of the paragraph, all that kind of. It's like, it reminds you of Macaulay, who has this fantastic paragraph structure always. So, and there was another sort of odd personal thing that happened. He used to refer to me as my boy.
Yes.
It was a patronizing kind of way. But he had a boy, Matthew. He had one son, and they were not at all close. And many years later, by pure chance, I became a close friend of Matthew's. And every time I went, we met on some committee, you know, every time I went to Washington, I used to stay at Matthew's house. I try and talk to him about his father sometimes. He sort of knew all the stuff that was in the biographies, but couldn't care less. I think he'd been a very young boy with a very old father, too. That may have had something to do with it. But anyway, that was Aldous Huxley. The last well-known figure I wanted to mention, before I get into anthropology, was this. I just got this position in UCLA, as I mentioned, and an old lady telephoned me from North Hollywood, said, would you be interested in coming over to my apartment to help me do some research on rituals in the Ethiopian church? And since I recognized the name, I said, yes, I will come. And that is how I ended up as the research assistant to Ruth St. Denis, the founder of modern dance, during what turned out to be the last year of her life. And,
what a wonderful experience.
She was wanting to do, and she did do, a final swan song on national television when she was about 83. And her idea was, maybe we can choreograph church rituals from Ethiopia. Where she got the idea from, I don't know, except she'd already delved around in India and Egypt and other civilizations. I found it couldn't be done, and I didn't kid her. I said, it's going to be terribly static and not the sort of thing. And so she eventually choreographed something else. But it was very nice to spend a lot of time with a figure who'd, you know, she was the teacher of Martha Graham. She literally started modern dance around 1902. And is, you know, the leading figure in all the histories of modern dance. So that was nice. But I should now move on to what I was doing in anthropology, because it became apparent fairly quickly that I had two interests. One was certainly South India. I did archaeology, culture history, social structure, language. I and Christian Pilot Raichur, who was at CNRS in Paris.
Can you just spell out the name?
Christian.
Yes.
Christian with an E on
yes.
it. Pilot, P-I-L-O-T, hyphen, R-A-I-C-H-O-O-R. Raichur is the name of her husband, who's a professor of French in Karnataka. Anyway, Christian and I wrote the only dictionary of the Badiya language ever. It's about 800 pages long, and it's still not, a complete dictionary, but anyway, it was a thorough attempt, and thereby a new Dravidian language was more or less discovered and put on the books. I wrote a number of books, and I'll mention only one or two later on, but this was only one interest, Badigas and Todas and other tribal societies in the south. And secondly, I was getting more and more interested in film. I had slight background in this. In Sydney, I had worked as a script writer in the early days of Australian television, working with a friend. We were writing scripts for children's programs. Nobody had any idea about how to do anything in television there. The ABC transferred a lot of their best radio broadcasters into television and assumed they would do okay. So I did that, and then I shot a bit of 16mm film while I was doing field work in South India, and got some ideas about that. Just how to handle a camera, basically. But then, Colin Young, as a product of Glasgow University and philosophy, I believe exactly the same background as the man who founded the documentary film movement in Britain, John Grierson.
John Grierson, yes.
I think Grierson was also from philosophy at Glasgow. Anyway, Colin was brilliant at many things. He knew how to make films. He was the editor of the Film Quarterly. He was a great theoretician. He was brilliant at making a budget out of nothing. So, tell him a grand project you're going to do. He just pulled the figures out of thin air, and you had a budget in 10 minutes that was realistic. Or, and this was his philosophy background, I'm sure, two groups of people in some committee would be arguing furiously with each other. He's the chairman, and he'd just stop and say, well, I see we're all in agreement on the following points. But he was very encouraging. And at that point, he launched the idea of an ethnographic documentary production program. And one of his associate professors, Richard Hawkins, was to be in charge of it, but he needed an anthropologist in it too, and so I went. And Richard and I, Hawkins and Hockings, which the Americans could never distinguish between, taught this thing for a couple of years.
Where was it?
UCLA Film School, the top film school in the country, and the one film school which was looking seriously at ethnographic film and not just documentary generally. There were other fine filmmakers there, including Mark McCarthy, who taught documentary in some respects as well. And McCarthy and I and others, I think Colin Young was in on most of these drinking sessions, decided we were totally dissatisfied with the documentary as it then existed. Maybe it was shot okay, but the big problem was just commentary. They all had commentaries. The commentaries were like the voice of God. They implied that whoever had written the script knew more about the subject matter than the people who appeared in the film. And if I, as an anthropologist, was involved in making a film, you would assume that I was the expert, therefore I was telling you what you ought to be looking at in the picture. And this seemed like the wrong way to go about it. And so we decided we would make a film in a new format where we would make it hard for ourselves by working in a language we'd never worked in before. And we would still try and make the film comprehensible to an American college audience, and we would have no commentary whatever at all. And so that's why we ended up in the Gaeltacht, in the west of Ireland, in the westernmost village in the old world, which is named Dunquin.
How is that spelled?
Well,
Dunquin.
You want it in anglicised?
Yes, anglicised, probably.
Dunquin. If you look at the map and you see the longest peninsula of Ireland sticking out in the Atlantic, on the very end of that is Dunquin. So we went there. It wasn't happenstance that we blundered into the place. I rented a car. I drove all up the west coast of Ireland, I looked at 300 villages, roughly, and we then narrowed it down, because we had a whole series of criteria about where we wanted to film. One was it had to be a village with a mountain right next to it, because we couldn't afford a helicopter to get in there to take aerial shots. And in the west of Ireland, the settlement pattern is very dispersed. It's not like the Irish villages you see in the films, which are long string of houses and pubs on a street all next to each other. This is, a farm here 200 yards away, a second farm, and so on. In 2 square miles, the population was 180 people. But we wanted that kind of a village then, with a mountain next to it, so that we could show the dispersed settlement pattern. Secondly, it had to be in a Gaelic-speaking area, of which there are about 8 or 9, because we wanted to do battle with this language, which is the worst, most difficult Indo-European language I've ever met, including anywhere in India. Because it's giving you 20th century pronunciations to 13th century spellings, so you can imagine the complexities. Anyway, we did take classes every morning and we tried to learn the language. My other criteria were I wanted a place to feel foreign enough that the 2 graduate students we took with us as assistants would feel some serious culture shock, and not find they can just operate in English all the time. It's like being in Maine or somewhere. And then I wanted a place where the people looked photogenic, and for some reason these people looked like characters in a Bergman film, looked like they'd been acting in films all their lives, although they'd never been in any. I liked the people. They were pleasant, welcoming to us, desperately poor, dirty, They were wearing suits that were their relatives had sent them from America 20 years before, that kind of thing. And then there was another criterion. I knew very well that as soon as I went back to the States and presented this film to my anthropological colleagues, the first question would be, when are you going to write the book? Because there was a dominant attitude in those days amongst such people as Walter Goldschmidt, whom I mentioned earlier, and many others, that we need books to explain these ethnographic films. Then they can be teaching tools, but you need to write the ethnography for us. Well, I wasn't prepared to sit down and write an ethnography on an Irish village, much as I would like to, when I had so much material from India that I needed to write up. And so I thought, well, there's only one way out of this, and that's to pick a village which already has the literature. And that narrowed it a great deal, because there were a couple of villages in County Clare where Arensberg and Kibble had written.
Yes.
And I looked at them, there's no mountains in sight anywhere, so we couldn't use those. And then was this incredible situation in Dunquin. Nowhere in the world, hardly, where you find peasants would you find what I found there. Offshore from Dunquin, 3 miles out to sea, is the Great Blasket Island.
Oh, yes, yes.
It used to have a village of about 100 people on it who would intermarry with Dunquin and had close relations with them, obviously, and were peasant fishermen. And they had been there for centuries and centuries. And around 1951, 52 in the winter time, the population had got down to, I think, about maybe 11 people, 9 or 10 of whom were over the age of 70, and 1 small boy for some reason. And then somebody died, and there was no consecrated ground to bury them on the island. They had to be taken to the church in Dunquin. For 6 weeks, they couldn't get the body across the 5 miles of 5 kilometers of ocean to bury it. They couldn't get a priest out to do the rites. And at that point, they decided they had to abandon the village, and the government of Ireland relocated them anywhere they wanted to go. Most of them just moved to Dunquin. But before those people had left, one woman had written her autobiography. It's a peasant woman sitting down and writing a book. another man there, Tomasa Kryn, had written a superb
I've got it.
autobiography, The Island Man.
I've got it, yes.
And a generation later, a third fisherman named Maurice O'Sullivan had written 20 Years Ago. All of them in this village of 100 people. And there were several others of not such importance, though now all of their stuff, I think, has been translated into English. They have the best publisher, Oxford University Press, publishes their stuff. And I felt these autobiographies are so rich, especially The Island Man, which I use all the time in teaching, that they totally substantiate everything in the film. I don't need to write anything to go along with it. And so that's how we chose to end up filming in Dunquin, and we made a film called The Village, which is still in distribution. In fact, this year it went into DVD, and we have a new distributor, DER, which distributes anthropological films in the States. And so it's had this tremendously long life and a successful life too. But that definitely got me into filming. Then
What was your role in this film? I mean,
it was in effect director, but we didn't want to say on the credits director, because the whole point of our approach was there is no direction. What we were filming was ongoing behavior. If you missed it, you didn't ask people, would you do that again, please? Or would you stand over here because the light's better? And so all the time we were either getting fuzzy picture or bad sound, but we had to put it all together, synchronize it.
it was on 16 mil.
16 millimeter, and we had very good equipment, Naga and Eclair, which is professional equipment. And Mark McCarthy was a fantastic cameraman, with a really excellent eye. He preferred working in black and white, so we shot it in black and white. If we'd shot it in color, it would have cost 4 times as much. It would have still looked black and white. The skies were grey, the seas were grey, the mountains were grey, the people wearing black, and that was about it. The houses were white. So the film did quite well, and eventually got a wonderful review by John Messenger, an American anthropologist. And it's been used around the world in teaching. I've shown it in many, many countries, including right here in China. But then I made a career move because they needed an anthropologist at MGM Studios. And so I went to MGM. Other than Hortense Powdermaker, who hung around the studios a long time ago, one of very few anthropologists who's actually worked in a studio. And it was to make a special film for NBC television. They had a spectacular night once a week called General Electric Hour, paid for by General Electric. And so this is what they wanted me to work on. At that time, MGM had a documentary division, and we were going to make a film which was called The Manhunters, on the origins of mankind, a recent research on paleoanthropology. And I worked with Clark Howell, who was the sort of inspiring theorist in all of this. But I did the legwork, obviously, of deciding where we shoot and so on. And by extraordinary good fortune that year, many of the really famous sites in paleoanthropology were in process of being re-excavated.
Which year was this? No?
1969. You know, it's Swartkrans and Mount Carmel and a number of places. And so we had a very small film crew. We went to South Africa, Israel, France, and, as it were, filmed the re-excavation of these famous sites and produced a film, a 1-hour film, which I have to say must have reached more people in the world than any other anthropologist had ever reached. In one night, I reached 52 million people.
Gosh.
In mostly all over North America. Later, we brought out German and Japanese editions. It was syndicated in Australia, all over the place. So
What was it called?
The Manhunters.
The Manhunters.
It's now totally out of date. Don't bother to look at it. But at that time, not even people like Margaret Mead had audiences that size in their lifetimes. So, and all the reviews said that we got the facts right, we hadn't messed up anything. Even the TV Guide had a rave review. And then I moved to the University of Illinois because they wanted somebody to set up a similar program, and I did for a while teach film production and anthropology there before the money ran out. But at least the nice thing was University of Illinois didn't have a fixed salary scale, and they said, we will match or better whatever was your last salary. Well, my last salary was a director at MGM, as you can imagine. Research director was the title. So that was a useful move. Chicago was a great place to be. It's very, very good for research facilities. And I developed many friendships with people like Soltax especially. And,
What was he like as well?
a charming man, very, very competent person. I used to sit in on his introductory anthropology courses. He gave these lectures with no notes whatever. I suppose he'd given them many times before. But, it was perfection in the introductory course. Once you'd heard him, you wanted to become an anthropologist. There are a few people like that. I think Klein Klucker may have been like that. At least his book, Mirror for Man, has turned more people into anthropology than any other book I can think of. So many
Turned me one into one.
yeah, so many professionals say, well, I first read that book and then I decided that's what I wanted to do. Anyway, that's another matter. But yeah, I had very nice friends there. And then in 1973, Sol and I and a small committee, FLK Sue from was Malinowski's
Sue.
student, Sue,
Yes.
HSU, was from China.
Francis Hugh.
We put together the program for the 9th World Congress of Anthropology. And I took charge of the film program. I think I got together 116 films from around the world, from dozens of countries, that these delegates were supposed to bring with them, and we screened films constantly for a week. A great problem with the Soviets, because they insisted on 35mm films, and that meant
Where was the
Soviet
conference?
in Chicago.
Ah, yes.
It was in Chicago. But something very good came out of that. Mouton, the publishers, had agreed with Sol that they would publish the proceedings. Well, up to that time, proceedings of a World Congress were 1 or 2 volumes that sat on the library shelf and didn't have any kind of unity to them, and maybe you open them if you were looking for one particular paper. But Sol, who was a tremendous organizer of everything, as you can see from his book Penny Capitalism, he has that special kind of mentality, said, well, we're going to make this into a real publishing venture. And Mouton agreed with him and eventually came up with the money. We're going to produce a series called World Anthropology. And anybody who wants to, who's involved in the Congress, can edit a volume for that series. You do not have to use the papers that have been submitted for the Congress. And so I thought, well, good, because what we need now is a book on visual anthropology. There isn't one. And so, well, as it happened, only about 3 papers had been submitted to the International Congress in visual anthropology, and they weren't that good, frankly. Some of them, one was, I think, but there wasn't a book there. However, I knew exactly what I wanted to do by way of a book, and Sol had told me I could do it. Back in 1968 at UCLA, we held something that was called the UCLA Colloquium on Ethnographic Film. And we brought together all of the major players in this field from Europe and North America, including Jean Rouch and Robert Gardner and Balixi, John Marshall, and a whole series of people who, as it were, became famous names in the field. I knew all these people from that conference, and so when Sol said, yes, you can go ahead and design the book you'd like, I simply peopled the table of contents with all of the leading figures from this conference we'd had 5 years before, wrote to each of them and said, will you write a chapter for this book? And each and every one of them said yes. And then Margaret Mead, who was with Sol, the sort of co-organizer of the World Congress, and was a very nice person, and I must say a very professional worker, said to me, what would you like me to write on? Because we'd agreed she'd write the opening chapter. I said, well, you know, I think what the real problem is with visual anthropology these days is that all of our professional colleagues are thinking in terms of sentences and paragraphs, just like us. You know, anthropology is presented in words. So I said, couldn't you write something that would point out that there might be another way of approaching the subject matter of culture? So she said yes, and she went off. And 3 weeks later, she mailed me this highly polished paper, exactly what I'd asked for, no title. So I titled it Visual Anthropology in a Discipline of Words, and the title stuck, and it's been quoted all over the place innumerable times. The book itself did very well. Sol told me it was the bestseller of the entire 94-volume series. It went into a number of reprints. It's the only book in that series that has come out in other languages. There was a short French edition. I published a Japanese edition. Very recently, I published a Chinese edition. And in English, the third edition came out recently. You know, it's now been around for, what, 30 years, but Mouton de Gruyter, the present publishers, said it's one of the best-selling books they've had in the last 20 years.
Fantastic.
And so I think that has put visual anthropology on the map a great deal. You go anywhere to any library or conference and you find this thing lying around. And for a long time, it was really the only book on visual anthropology, so the unfortunate students had to keep rehashing the same chapters in it, and did. I wrote quite a number of books on South Indian cultures, because that was one of my fields. I edited several for Oxford. And I guess it turned out that I was reasonably efficient at editing, because I ended up in the 1990s with 3 huge editing projects. One, I was asked by Mel Ember to edit.
Mel?
Ember?
Ember.
Ember, who's the head of the HRAF at Yale. Melvin Ember, to be exact. He asked me to edit the South Asia volume of the Encyclopedia of World Cultures. And then I edited the Southeast and East Asia volumes of that as well. So in fact, 20% of the entire encyclopedia was mine. And it involved writing to several hundred people to ask them to write concise accounts of particular cultures. On the basis of that, more recently, I was the South Asia editor for the Encyclopedia of Modern Asia, which just came out in 6 volumes. The Encyclopedia of World Cultures was 11 volumes. These are major reference works that the students are rehashing all the time all over the world. The articles are so neatly designed with headings and subheadings that you can do criminal things in the way of producing a term paper quickly. But anyway, I did that, and then something else happened. Jay Ruby, who had early back in the 70s, I suppose, run a visual anthropology magazine for a journal for 11 years, I believe. Studies in Visual Communication was his title much of the time. Got together with a publisher and dreamt up a new journal called Visual Anthropology, which I think he began in 1989. It had nice glossy paper, and thus high quality photographic reproduction. He got some good contributors right from the start because it was highly international in its sales and its contributors. But after about 3 volumes, he decided, or at least this is what he told me, he wasn't really very good at editing. And he didn't like it, and so I was asked to edit it. And so I became the editor of Visual Anthropology from volume 4 on, and now we're in volume 18, and I still have a contract for a few more years. So that gave me a very central position in the whole business of visual anthropology. And it, in a sense, allowed me to define what visual anthropology is, just by table of contents, so to speak. The problem I discovered early on was that there are people who can make brilliant films who cannot write a coherent English sentence, or French sentence for that matter. There was only about one exception to this statement, who was my own student, David McDougall, who writes superbly, films superbly, and does everything right. And, but he's one of a kind. And so I realized this journal won't survive if we concentrate on ethnographic film, because in the 60s and 70s, visual anthropology was taken as being more or less the equivalent of ethnographic film. John Collier was, of course, always saying there's still photography as well, which he was brilliant at, and he wrote for my book on still photography, and a classic piece now, I suppose. But I wanted to make sure it was more than ethnographic film, and so I, of course, solicited articles from people all over the place. But I wanted to make sure we covered things like theatre, circuses, masks, rock art, tattoos, prehistory, and so on. We have even done one or two papers in primatology, Near Eastern archaeology. In other words, I needed it to be as broad as possible to make sure I was getting sufficient contributions, and this has worked. They're rolling in still from all over the world, and the quality still seems very high. It doesn't matter to me what the quality is, really the contributors define the standard, don't they? And I publish quite a lot of graduate student work. I mean, why not? Don't need a PhD to write in our journal. And this is good for them because it helps their career along. But the journals managed to have, quite a central place in visual anthropology just because of this. Recently, I became a professor emeritus from the University of Illinois, not really because they were trying to get rid of me, or I was getting old, or tired, or sick, or any of those reasons, but I found that, I could stop teaching and still get 90% of my salary for not teaching, and that made sense. And now I'm teaching in Hong Kong, and late in life have suddenly become the first English dean, I believe, of a Chinese university in over 60 years. I'm the Dean of Social Sciences and Humanities in a brand new college we've set up in Zhuhai, which is right next to Macau, run jointly by Hong Kong Baptist University and Beijing Normal University, which is going to give, we hope, quality undergraduate education entirely in English to Chinese students. And after 4 years, I hope to develop a graduate program. I'm planning to develop a film production program there within a couple of years, and make it one of this cluster of very fine universities that are around the Pearl River in Macau, Hong Kong, Canton, and now Zhuhai.
Just returning for a moment to all the people who you've known, if you had to single out the person, if you divided anthropology into the theoretical side and into the ethnographic collection of interesting materials, and if you had to rank one or two as the people who struck you as the most talented in those two respects, you mentioned very strongly Robert Murphy, but
Murphy and Ronald Cohen were both excellent in theory and in putting it over, of course. I mean, Murphy, it helped that we always had a jug of beer at the seminar, but he also brought in people like Irving Goffman, for example, and being at Berkeley you can get a lot of Nuri Alman and a number of other people like that, so we had a number of visitors that gave us a broader perspective on things. Yes, Murphy and Cohen would be the outstanding figures. Mandelbaum was very good on theory, caste theory. I also had a close relationship with Louis Dumont because I was one of the translators of his book on ideologies. And so you know, I'd read all of his stuff, and I, in a sense, I regret I never had a chance to study with him, because I still think that his book on the Pramalay Kalara is probably the best ethnography ever to come out of India, badly translated as it was into English. But I really admire what he did. But Mandelbaum taught me a vast amount about the structure of Indian society, which is obviously useful.
And so, in terms of ethnographer, you put Dumont very high.
Oh yes, yes, I think so. I like the French scholars, many of whom were friends of mine, Francis Zimmermann, Marie-Louise Reyniche, who's another superb.
Can you spell that?
Reyniche, R-E-I-N-I-C-H-E, is another superb South Indian ethnographer who directed this incredible series that, if you haven't seen, you should have seen. 5 huge sort of atlas-sized volumes on the city of Tiruvannamalai.
So can you spell it?
Tiruvannamalai. I can spell it in Tamil if you like.
We can probably find it.
That's the title of the book anyway. It's one of these old temple towns that's a pilgrimage centre. And a group of French scholars studied it from every conceivable point of view: architecture, festivals, history, you know, you name it. They've done it somewhere in this huge series of atlas-like volumes. Tiruvannamalai is Tiruvannamalai.
Thank you.
Tamil word. It's a superb book, and it shows you the quality of French ethnography. I don't think anyone's doing it better. And these people are both Zimmermann and Reyniche, I think, are students of Dumont's. They've had a lot of contact with them. I was very close to Francis Zimmermann because he was interested, of course, in medical anthropology. His wife is a doctor, and I wrote a book on medical anthropology with the Badigas, and so his work on medical anthropology is also in South India, so, you know, we have a lot in common.
And then turning to ethnographic or anthropological filmmakers, you spoke highly of David McDougall.
Yes, there's bias here, no doubt. When McCarthy and I made that film in Ireland, we were very conscious. We were trying to make a new style of film, get rid of the commentary, and make it comprehensible, even though it's in Gaelic. Make it comprehensible by structure and by subtitling the Gaelic to American students, and I suppose British students too, if they're interested. And this became called observational cinema.
Yes.
Ours was the very first film made in that style, although the McDougalls were in our film school right then. They were cutting films in their style, the same style, but came out a little later. It turned out that film had real historic significance, not just for the reason I've given, that this particular style of documentary is illustrated by, but 2 or 3 years later, Ireland joined the common market. And then the economy in Ireland began to boom. And as Chairman Mao said long ago, a rising tide lifts all the boats. And it did in Ireland too. People around Dublin who were now in IT business and were making piles of money wanted weekend cottages and getaway places. And so they went to Dunquin, they bought up old cottages, fixed them up, or built new cottages there. You can get there in a 5-hour drive from Dublin, after all. They employed lots of local people to help in all this reconstruction. The place has had a booming tourist industry ever since we left it. I don't think because of us, but because David Lean went there and made this rather bad film, Ryan's Daughter, for MGM. The same time I was working in MGM, he was making that. I believe he saw our film, or one of his minions did, and that's how they got the idea they'd go and shoot in that village. But from that and the general development of the tourist industry in Ireland, this place now has a good standard of living, lots of money. Whereas when we were there, not only was it very poor, it was very sad. I think that the population we saw in that village, which was clearly old, as you can see from the film, very few children, and some of those are visiting children. It was a very old population of people who were something like social relics. They weren't smart enough, educated enough, or knew English enough to emigrate to the United States, or even to Liverpool. So, or some tried and were turned back by US immigration. So there they are there. And you'd see in a house 2 or 3 old men and 2 or 3 old women living together, and you'd think, oh, that's nice, you know, in their old age they've got together and they're supporting each other, and you know, when one of them's widowed, the others will support them. And then you discover none of those people has ever been married. They're a bunch of brothers and sisters, and they've been living together since birth. And
I've seen this in the Outer Hebrides.
Oh yes, it's very sad. But now it's all changed. And our film turned out to be practically the last serious document on peasant society in the British Isles, which had been there for 5,000 or 6,000 years. There is no peasant society now, it's all touched by capitalism. At the time we made that film, I found there was still a barter economy going on. There was no way of getting it into the film, but people would exchange a dozen eggs for a cabbage, a load of peat for a chicken, this kind of thing. And this is the late 20th century.
I was, this has all been marvellous. I've got just a couple last questions, if I may. One about China. As you mentioned, you're now the first dean of a Chinese university, and also you're doing...
That's what I've heard, anyway. Seems likely.
It seems unlikely as anyone else. And you're doing quite a lot of work in Yunnan, you mentioned.
Yes.
How would you assess the potentials for anthropological research in China, and particularly the southwest now?
Everybody says Yunnan is the place to be. It is full of foreign students wandering around, good and bad, doing field work. I was just one amongst an army who turned up there in recent years. They're very welcoming, and there are no political restrictions that I know of. To show up, for example, I've been in many Chinese villages all over the country because I've travelled in every corner of China. And 10 years ago when I first did this, you could go into villages where you would see the red flag flying on a mast in the middle of the village. Now, in recent years, I haven't seen any red flags anywhere, unless it's on the front of a government building, like a police station, maybe a post office. They are finished with the red flag in the villages. I went to a village where I've been doing a bit of work not far from Kunming, on the big lake in Kunming. And this was a couple of years ago now. Certainly there's no red flag there. I found the party headquarters, the offices of the Communist Party, an archaeological site rather like the ruined village on the Blasket Island I spoke about earlier. The padlock on it was rusted. One can assume the key was lost. Windows were broken. The whole thing was covered in dust. It had posters stuck on it that were 20 years old. That's the end of it. Then I sought out the village headman, who's sort of like a small mayor, and I just walked into his office and said, pleased to meet you. May I ask you a few questions? First of all, what's the population of the village now? He said, 1,324. I said, how many families? 273. And then I asked a whole series of questions like that. He never once said to me, who the hell are you? And no problem. I was with a young lady who was helping me and interpreting, and she didn't say who I was. It was obvious I wasn't a local Chinese. No problem at all. Very, very open. Nobody talks about... I know there is politics, like there's campus politics at Yunnan University, for example. And they told me dire stories about some time back when the governor's bodyguard shot the governor and became the governor in classic Chinese fashion. So, but this is politics of another sort. But nobody's really, doing things there. I won't say caution. I was talking with a good friend from television there about the Dalai Lama, because I visited the Dalai Lama's house in the Dharamsala. And so he said to me something like, what sort of a man is he? I said, well, I didn't meet him. From everything I've seen, he seems like a really nice man. And he said, well, we better not talk about that anymore. You know, we were walking down the street in Lijiang at the time.
Yes.
You know, so I mean, maybe the people in television are under restrictions, and in fact they're told only to use the Xinhua news agency for news material. But so far as people like us are concerned, there's no restriction. And I'll let you into a big secret about the Chinese polity. For many years, there were huge tracts of China that were closed to foreigners. And the CIA, in its wisdom, and no doubt other similar organizations, figured there must be some tremendous, military secrets there that we'd really love to find out about. I've been through some of these tracts. I can tell you what the secret is. Nowhere in the entire province is there a Western-style toilet. The toilets are disgusting. I have been in toilets where, to put it very frankly, there were pigs underneath me at the time.
Yes, so
and they didn't want foreign tourists to have this kind of awful experience, so they just closed the province.
That's a lovely story. It would be very tempting to end there, but is there any other thing that you wanted to say before we ended? Message to the future or to our students or anything?
I don't know about that. I'm not a prophet. But I sat at the feet of a great prophet in Sydney, Jiddu Krishnamurti, who was a wonderful man and whom Annie Besant had picked out as the new Messiah in the, she discovered him in the Theosophical Society in Madras. And to his great credit, when he grew up, he renounced the Theosophical Society and their Order of the Red Star, or whatever it was called, and he said, I'm not any kind of Messiah. And he developed, I think, a very astute, non-religious message. His interest is educational psychology, as I see it. And he spent his entire life walking around the world, just talking to people. Brilliant lecturer, never used any notes or anything. And he had come to Sydney about 1928 or 29 when he was still supposed to be the Messiah. And in the middle 1950s, he made his first return visit, and all these old lady theosophists turned out to come and see if he was still going to lead them or something. But he didn't, but I was privileged to sit at his feet for a number of evenings and just listen to this. And I think that if we've had any great guide for the 20th century, and why not the 21st as well, it was probably Krishnamurti.
Lovely.
Non-religious, non-spiritual, non-prophetic, just very, very rational, sensible guidance for the entire world.